Okay, numbers seem to have stabilised. Hello, welcome everyone to our first Architectural Humanities book talk for semester 2, 2025. My name is Cameron Logan and I convene the Histories of Architecture and Built Environment group at the University of Sydney, along with Daniel Ryan, who's put together the book talk series this and last semester. Daniel, unfortunately, can't be with us. He's in Sao Paulo, where it's 4 a.m. And yeah, he decided not to get up early. I'm coming to you from Gadigal Bidjigal land between the Cooks River and Walleye Creek in Sydney, and I firstly want to recognise and pay respects to the elders and communities past and present of the lands where I am, and to extend that recognition and acknowledgement to the lands where you might be calling in from in Sydney and beyond, by the looks of people who've come in, and just to acknowledge the knowledge that's been shared on these lands for generations. We're thrilled to have Amanda Akmadi, Paul Walker, and Soon Sue Speechley join us today to talk about their new book, Architectural Encounters in Asia Pacific, Built Traces of Intercolonial Trade, Industry and Labour, 1800s to 1950s, published by Bloomsbury. Amanda, Paul, and Soon Sue are all members of the Australian Centre for Architectural History, Urban and Cultural Heritage, ACA-Hutch, at the University of Melbourne. We're also delighted to have Andrew Leach, our recently dear departed from the University of Sydney, but QUT's new Professor of Architectural History, as a respondent for the talk. And the talk is being recorded and will be available on the Architecture, Design and Planning's YouTube channel in coming days. Over to you, Amanda, Paul, and Soon Sue. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cameron, and really appreciate the opportunity to share our books. And I'm really excited the conversation with Andrew, who's also one of the contributor in the book. But from the very beginning, on behalf of my editorial team, we would also like to pay our respect to the traditional owner of the land on which Soon Sue, myself, and Paul Walker are currently based in Melbourne. So we pay our respect to past, present, and emerging elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We would like to start by explaining how the book came about. And as Cameron mentioned earlier, the three of us, we are affiliated with the ACA-Hutch, Australian Centre for Architectural History, Urban and Cultural Heritage. And in fact, the book is an outcome of one of the annual symposium that we convened in the middle of COVID lockdown in 2021. It was an entirely international conversation facilitated virtually via Zoom, but something fascinating about our interconnectivity that in fact it resonated with the focus of our conversation in that symposium, built traces of intercolonial encounters in the form of unprecedented buildings for trade and industrial scale resource extraction across Asia Pacific's multiple colonial entities, as well as their successor nation states. And while back then we were able to proceed with the international symposium through Zoom, the broader network of social and urban interconnectivities we benefit from pretty much depend on their legacy of mobilities of ideas, labor, capital, and commodities established long time ago. Networks that traverse the world through the history of trade and colonialism. But beyond the symposium itself, the book reflects an ongoing conversation among diasporic architectural historians who are working and living outside the sites of our main historiographical focuses. The question that we always ask ourselves is, how do we ensure that our research and the specificity of our materials are meaningful and engaging outside the immediate cultural audiences and geographical location of our research topics? And how do we craft architectural historiography for the 21st century and speak to its contradicting dynamics, where borderless flows of capitals, knowledge, and commodities are sadly matched with the hardening of national borders and the return of insular nationalism? So the Asia-Pacific region is our point of departure in this book, with most of contributors coming from the region and operating within its cross-cultural community. The region is obviously vast, we all know, very diverse, and which partially explain why it has been the frontier and still is the frontier of global writing of architecture history up to today. And the region's complex historical architectural landscape still occupy the margin of UNESCO's list of World Heritage Site. The maritime zone it forms part of, however, as this book describes, entail a spatially complex history of interconnectivity, not unlike our present condition. Architecture encountered in Asia Pacific is a conversation about the unprecedented building for trade, industry, and resource extraction from across Asia Pacific. It is an attempt to really confront and start tracing those interconnectivities within our region through the lens of architecture history. In this book, we brought together studies which really explore border crossing agencies and building practices that facilitate flows of commodity, craft, labor, and expertise across the region. It seeks to illuminate the built manifestation of shared histories of trade and labor mobility, a tapestry of social thread that wove across dispersed continental maritime zone. It seeks to complement a geographical coverage of the seminal Sir Bannister Fletcher's Global History of Architecture and the forthcoming Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture of the World by specifically focusing on colonial building typologies and architectural infrastructure that have multiple intracolonial origins within the Asia-Pacific region. The intention is to bring to the fore processes and cross-cultural influences that connect colonial territories, place, and history. And in exploring architecture across colonial borders and buildings that are created for entities that cross those boundaries, the book seeks to challenge one of the lasting legacy of 19th century colonialism, which is the fragmentation of architectural historiography of Asia Pacific. The production of building associated with trade and industry did not conform to the politically constructed colonial borders. In fact, the flows of goods, craft, and labor and expertise rendered those colonial borders porous. So at this point, I just want to kind of start shifting into a specific chapter that each of us contribute specifically. And each of the chapter in the book really trying to showcase those intra-colonial history. And in the chapter that Paul Walker and I wrote, we trace the operation of KPM, which is a Dutch shipping companies operating primarily within Dutch East Indies, and Burnsville, and their operation, in fact, reveal this connected histories of emerging colonial settlements and port settlements at the time. So we talk about case studies linking eastern cities of Indonesia, such as Makassar, with Suva and Apia, as well as location in Northern Australia. And it's a chapter that allow us to realize that the history, colonial history of Indonesia, Australia, and South Pacific are much more connected than we previously thought. And at this point, maybe I'll just kind of shift across to Sun Chu to introduce your chapter.
Yes, thank you. So the chapter that I wrote with Julie sort of tackles a problem that Amanda flagged, that sort of fragmentation of architectural history into really national stories. And so looking at professional networks and professional mobilities. And what we kind of found in that chapter really was that there were all these different opportunities for architects to really travel the world, either working for things like public works departments or joining infrastructure projects in sort of new colonial frontiers. but that these weren't the kind of linear narratives that you often get of sort of traveling from the imperial metropole to the colonial periphery, but often quite, multi-stage and complex journeys. So you have engineers who might start their career in Scotland, then move to China or India, Brazil, and then end up in Singapore. And they're all bringing ideas with them along the way. So looking at some of these kind of complex journeys that architects were having, but also sort of uncovering some of the porosity of these, I guess, imperial boundaries. So architects might travel between sort of different imperial worlds, sort of straddling the British and French empires, for example, often facilitated by these sort of external networks, things like the Paris Foreign Mission Society, for example, and the networks of the Catholic Church. But for me, one of the things that's also quite interesting, I suppose, is that these networks prove to be surprisingly durable and often outlast empire itself. And so what we see is, for example, the post-war kind of political sphere um, and the Cold War that emerges after that then sees a great number of Southeast Asian architects, for example, coming to Australia to train. And so not going to the former imperial metropole, but to travel between two former British colonies effectively and create these other forms of networks and reinforce some of these networks. And I might pass to Paul at this point.
Sorry.
You're muted.
Yes. The chapter I did with my colleague, or our colleague, Karen Burns, was on a biscuit manufacturing company founded by a man called Thomas Swallow, who on his journey to the Australian goldfields from California in 1852 thought he would make his fortune out of sea biscuits rather than gold. And this company that he founded, Swallow & Ariel, was very successful for basically 100 years until 1960 when it got absorbed into Arnott's. And it was the Swallow & Ariel was one of the most famous brands in Australia during this period, and not entirely forgotten. Now, one of the things that we're interested in with Swallow & Ariel is they constantly promoted their modernity through their images of their mechanisation, both of their factories and biscuit factories in Melbourne, but also the sugar plantation called Hambledon that Swallow established in the 1880s. He had a commercial model of kind of integration of kind of various kinds of stages of production. But although both the factories and this plantation were promoted in the media according to images of their modernity, the use of technology, in fact, in both places, it was labour that made them productive, and in particular in Queensland, the labour of the Pacific Islander indentured labourers. The other thing that Swallow & Ariel did in the 1880s, particularly at the same time that they're developing the sugar plantation, is they're promoting their products internationally through exhibitions. On the left, you see the Melbourne exhibition of 1880, but they were active internationally in exhibitions in Paris, London, Calcutta, and Philadelphia. And so they're sort of promoting an image of kind of consumer desirability, I suppose, through these events, at which they built little pavilions called trophies, in which their biscuits were part of the walls effectively. And so what we're curious about in this case is the sort of contrast between these projections of modernity in the media and in these exhibitions, and the reality of the labour conditions, both in their factories and in their sugar plantation. I'll leave it there.
Is that Thanks a lot, Amanda, Sensu, and Paul. So that I now introduce, or I introduced before, Andrew Leach, who's going to respond to the book. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Cameron, and thank you, Amanda and Sunzu and Paul, for this introduction to architectural encounters and for your account of the project that it documents. As Amanda mentioned at the outset, I'm something of an outsider's insider on this occasion, commenting on something to which I've contributed along with Stuart King, who I don't see here, but I guess he'll watch at some point. So I know this book both as a book through the whole process of production, as well as a discussion, a very enjoyable discussion, and also as somebody who is invested in its gains. Over the last couple of weeks, it's been one of two books with which I've been a bit preoccupied, and I want to talk about them both. The other one is Andrei Tavares's Architecture Follows Fish. This subject to another book discussion coming up in Sydney at the Euroshop in a few weeks' time, sometime in October. But it deals with some of the same issues that this volume addresses. Its project is to ask how the sea also makes architectural histories geographies, and how that which the sea allows and that which the sea demands, what it allows, spanning industrial activity, resource extraction, including fishing, and the specific architectures necessitated by different species, large population movements, professional mobilities, etc., resonating with much that you've heard already, and also what it demands, including administrative, diplomatic, technical, and political arrangements. In a couple of weeks' time, again related, but making the circle slightly larger, a thematic conference of the European Architectural History Network at Porto called The Built Ocean will draw this frame of reference closer to the present, largely in Northern Hemispheric terms, although I note that our colleague from UTS, Andrew Toland, will represent our bit of the world. So I think that there is a moment in which this switch from the terrestrial to the maritime is proving fruitful for many people in many different ways across scholars in the history of architecture. Any new book, excuse me, that documents and tests a discussion like architectural encounters will, of course, be full of novel insights. I learned so much more about biscuits than I knew before. And we're lucky, especially to have a volume that's focused on Asia Pacific and the entangled relationships of this vast and yet often overlooked oceanic region. Even in its most basic politics, it acts as a counterpoint to the built ocean of the North Atlantic and its various peripheries. I think this book makes clear certain things that haven't been so explicit in the architectural historiography of the Asia-Pacific region, such as it is, until rather recently. Less through oversight than by not reaching for the kinds of frames that this book here makes very clear, taking mechanisms that haven't necessarily been articulated or which have been treated as common knowledge, assumed knowledge, but now testing them through intensive scholarship. The architectural production, for instance, underpinning maritime relationships and laid bare by exploring them, intersects with but hardly maps neatly onto the landscape of works that have acquired significance through historiographical attention over the last century, say. And even when they do intersect, the pull of the sea, as it were, tends to change the basis of their significance markedly. Matters of trade and the architecture of import-export track this in one register, as the book's second part makes very clear. Likewise, the mobility of ideas and professional knowledge in a world in which we've been bound to the Earth's surface. And an industry like whaling, on which Stuart and I wrote, makes a certain claim on various registers of architectural history, from urban street lighting, for example, to the structures of the whaling vessels themselves. And I note, I mean, this is to plug Andrew Toland again, that whaling is something that he'll come back to in his contribution to the built ocean. The importance of the maritime frame for the architecture and even the grey architecture of agriculture, including plantation agriculture, as well as the proliferation of herds, feels though like a larger and more demanding claim on the relationship between land and sea, as one of the places that this book takes us. We're fortunate, I think, to have a model off which to work, as we build on the insights that this book documents. And my time is short, so this brings me to my question to the editors to open things out to discussion. So looking ahead, having done the work that you've done, how does this book set an agenda for future scholarship concerned with the sea and in this region in particular? What kind of thinking do you think remains to be done?
I've done quite a lot of talking on behalf of my team. Maybe I'll just invite Paul and Sunchu to start.
Well, I mean, I think we are all very mindful of the way architectural histories have been mostly written in sort of nationalist terms, especially I think in former colonial lands. Anxious as they are about their own identities, and this is particularly true in Australia and I think Indonesia. And so one of the things I think that we and partly this has been overcome, I guess, recently through the writings of someone like Alex Bremner writing about empire. But I think again, it's the sort of dialogue between different empires that happens across boundaries. Commercial entities like Burns Philp were certainly mindful of their place in the British Empire, but they were happy to go anywhere where they could make money. And that included Dutch towns or Dutch colonial towns, German colonial territories before the First World War, and so on. So, and I think that produces a different kind of a different kind of dispersal than empire does. And I think one of the things I'm very, very happy about with this book is the number of voices we were able to elicit to participate in it, who are actually located in Indonesia and Japan and so on. So I mean, I think that there's also I think in scholarship we need to be listening to kind of dispersed voices that are located in institutions and places where we haven't really paid much attention to in the past. And I think that I know Amanda, who worked with her Indonesian colleagues on one of those chapters, there were certain difficulties in doing that, because I think the institutional expectations of what this kind of work could be in, say, an Indonesian institution are quite different than they might be at the University of Melbourne. And so I think there's also a kind of you're kind of dealing with adjacencies of our own present moment of institutions and trying to build alliances, because this is what we really have to do.
I think, yeah, there's similarly, I think the book does one of the things I like about it is that, it bridges sort of architectural history and heritage. I think those two can often get a little bit siloed, and you often sort of have a book that speaks to heritage practitioners or to architectural historians. But I think, with a lot of the sort of chapters that deal with this former colonial infrastructure as heritage, there is that kind of broader question of how we think about these things. And I think, things often get, protected on a very local level, but, they're very much implicated in these bigger kind of transnational networks. So thinking about them, I guess, beyond the local heritage listing or questions of immediate local management is another kind of interesting aspect that this hopefully paves the way for.
Yeah, and I think to build on Paul's and Sunchu's reflection, I do find the shift towards oceanic connection sort of allowing freedom and possibilities, because I think terracentric conceptualization of history tends to focus on borders, what is happening within borders. And I think the notion of connectivities, because I think water-based connection is a reflection of how we are interdependent of one another. We are always in search of something elsewhere, and kind of acceptance of that we need to operate beyond physical borders. And I think that fluidity is something that liberating, and I think it allows you to kind of conceptualize history in a much more dynamic way. And I think if we trace maritime network, there's so many overlaps there. And that overlaps is also fascinating because it allows thickness of our exploration rather than kind of crystallizing and kind of arriving at one explanation. In fact, that there is multiple stories that often have some sort of notes and connection and disperse again. And I think that makes exploration of history much more dynamic. And I think that's sort of future direction to really try to listen and pay attention to those notes of connection.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for that. We have a few minutes remaining. Happy to take one or two quick questions, and if anyone logged in has a question. If not, I just want to follow up with Sunchu about the question you just raised about heritage listing management, how this relates. I suppose just a basic one. Are you, when you're encountering these processes of listing and heritage management in the places that the book encounters, and particularly obviously in the work you've done, are you finding reference to the significance of these places being articulated by relation to their, the transnational networks and the kind of issues you're wanting to raise? Or are they primarily saying this is interesting because it was designed by somebody and it was a typical 19th century industrial building in some stylistic mode or whatever? In other words, are they getting at the forms of significance you're pointing to?
I think there's often sort of a limited acknowledgement of, the fact that, a place was a trading port, or that this, reflects, commodities being exchanged. But I think then, the two are often interrelated. So, the fact that new building technologies or techniques get transported to different places, that there's kind of confluence of these ideas, also then creates challenges in terms of things like conservation, where, often local sort of approaches to conservation are very much grounded in the sort of dominant mode of building. So yeah, I think there's scope for, our lenses to be broadened, I guess.
Sure. And if I can just take the chair's prerogative for one more. I was just curious about what, Paul, you said about the institutional, the working with people cross-institutionally and from places that you might not be accustomed to, or that perhaps historians of architecture working in Australia and New Zealand, for example, might not have done as much in the past as they might have. I'm just interested in, perhaps Amanda can answer this question, given that you said, what specifically, would you point to something specific that's causing misunderstandings or about institutional pressures that Paul's alluding to there? Something. What are they, or how would you characterize them?
Yeah, the chapter that I co-author with my Indonesian colleagues, the starting point is their research of the particularity of particular location in Central Java. And I think they tend to write to audience within Indonesia, and to focus on the dynamic between local elites and the Dutch colonial government. And then sort of my conversation, and obviously they also work on research collection that are primarily kind of archive within Indonesia. So the cataloging of archive is pretty much driven by the logic of nation building, and the whole rhetoric of decolonization. And meanwhile, in my through my conversation with them, and I start kind of linking the specificity, I guess, contextualizing the particular logic of cataloging the archive in Indonesia with emerging kind of transnational catalog categories, the way, for example, resources in Singapore, which also contain a lot of material about Dutch East Indies, are organized. And I think that's the process of translation and kind of trying to kind of contextualize the specificity of archive when we consider different type of terminologies, kind of allow us to kind of challenge the assumption of specific narrative that we can build on. And I think for me, I'm also kind of very interested in sort of seeing the way collection of colonial Dutch East Indies are categorized, for example, in National Library of Australia and National Gallery of Australia. That different terminologies also kind of challenge my assumption about colonial history of Indonesia. And so that's sort of instances that I'll continue to reflect on.
I think you've sort of addressed in part that there's a question that's come in on the chat, and we'll make this the last one. But perhaps one of the other co-editors want to address what Zheng has put on there, which is about, I guess, tensions between existing national narratives and in sort of historiographies, I guess, and then the sort of the push to bring in these transnational frames. And you're partly addressing that in some of the remarks you just made there, Amanda, but I wonder if one of the other two co-editors wanted to reflect upon that question that's in the chat now.
I think, one of the things that we faced in producing the book out of the seminar thing that we held through ACHUTCH was that the publishers wanted us to expand the geography really to go into North Asia as well as Southeast Asia and Australia. So I spent some time looking at Taiwanese scholarship on the sugar industry there, which was really promoted by the colonial authority there, which was Japan, and with a whole history which I have absolutely no understanding of whatsoever. And I discovered there were heritage scholars, and attempts to turn these sites of forced labor into heritage sites and so on and so forth. And and I think and it's very clear that the Taiwanese universities have a really sophisticated kind of infrastructure for constructing knowledge and so on. But we're completely ignorant of it. I mean, and really the sugar industry in Japan, in Taiwan, it's almost exactly a parallel to the sugar industry in Australia, where you have indentured labor, so I mean, I really think the publishers were quite right to force our hand to say expand your geography. We couldn't actually lure any Taiwanese collaborator into the project, I think, because they're perfectly happy with their own world. But it just made me think, that someone could write a history of the sugar industry in Java, in Queensland, and Taiwan, and they would be almost exactly parallel, but also incredibly culturally distinct. So I just don't think if we stay with national frameworks that we're going to do this.
Yeah. All right. So that's it. Sinchi, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are obviously challenges where, there are very strong kind of national ideas about how history looks in many parts of the world. But I do think that, the strength of, this kind of scholarship is it allows us to kind of complicate those stories, to ask ourselves, okay, what is being told in those narratives? And what can we learn through kind of these kind of broader kind of exchanges and kind of shared histories.
Yeah, so a lot more work to be done by the sounds of it, basically, and more effort to be made in building the networks and relationships that you've modeled here. So I better wind it up there. I'll get in trouble with Daniel Ryan, our absent boss, for not following the strict 30-minute seminar series and for losing our reputation for concision, which he's worked so hard to develop. But I do want to thank you so much for jumping online at the end of your day and sharing the work with us, and to everyone else who's come along to engage with Sunchu, Paul, and Amanda. So thank you very much, and look forward to hearing more about the work and an expanded network perhaps in the next project. Thanks, folks.
And thank you for having us.